I'm Sami Atabani. I'm an IP consultant, and just as in case somebody who hasn't attended the previous session, I work for ARM and have done so for the last 25 years. In a variety of roles, starting as a hardware development engineer and then gradually moving into the business side and the legal side. I'm not a qualified lawyer, but I obviously work very, very closely with our legal team and over the past 10 years or so built knowledge around open source and how we sort of interact with open source and obviously involved in a number of open initiatives such as the OpenUK and OpenChain. Now, just as a quick recap, in the last session we did talk about how most organizations interact with, actually I should have checked, can you see my slides?
I'm on the telephone, so no, I can't.
I can, yes, yeah.
But those on the call can, yes.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. So I think if you recall last time, I did talk about how organizations interact with open source, mainly either they consume it to develop their own products or to combine with their own commercial products, or on the sort of turquoise blue side and the green side, they might collaborate and engage directly with open source. So whereas in the collaborate, for example, they could be contributing to open source projects such as the Linux kernel or LLVM, or they could create their own project. For example, for ARM, it would be the ARM Embed OS or ARM-NN. These are specific projects that ARM released and manages as open source projects. So that's just a quick introduction. Now, we also talked about, oops, sorry, my slide is not moving forward. Okay, I'll have to resort to the mouse. I don't know what happened there. I think we did talk about, sorry, I'm just flickering through. We talked about the different types of licenses, and I deliberately didn't go into too much detail as I'm conscious that Andrew is going to do a session next week, going into a little bit more detail on open source licenses. But at a high level, I did talk about some of the open source licenses are permissive in their nature, where you can take the open source code and then either combine it or with your own code, you can modify it. And broadly, there would be sort of very small or minor obligations that you as a distributor of the combined code have to comply with. On the other side, on the right-hand side, we see the copyleft licenses. Generally, copyleft licenses have a broader set of obligations where, as a user, if you distribute, you have to either release the source code, any associated source code, including any derivative works in the strong copyleft side of things, and I'm sure Andrew will talk about that next week. Mm-hmm. Or it could be what is referred to as weak copyleft, where you might only be required to, for example, distribute the source code for the files which you modify. So again, it varies depending on the type of license. Now, and I also talked about how important the use case. So, for example, if you are taking source code and releasing it as is, that creates a different set of obligations as compared to if you're taking some source code and then modifying it and then distributing. That might create a different set of obligations that you need to comply with. So again, in the context of open source, it is really important to think about how you are handling the open source, how are you interacting with that open source. So for instance, if you are just taking it and distributing it, there might be minimal set of obligations on you. Or if you are not distributing and using as a cloud service, you might find that actually that creates a different set of obligations. Sorry, excuse me, my coffee has arrived. Come on in, Jonas. Come on, Benya. Sorry, excuse me for a second. No, it's not locked, it's open. Sorry, bear with me for 1 second. Close the door behind. Yeah. Sorry about that. My delivery coffee has arrived. I was saying that that it's important to think of the use case, because that is generally a trigger of what compliance obligations will be imposed on you as a user of that code. And again, we talked about distribution in the form of cloud services, depending on the license. In some licenses, that might be considered as a distribution. In other licenses, it may not be considered as distribution. So the obligations that are imposed on the person using the code could be quite different. Now, one of the things that we didn't get to last time is really at a high level, sort of why is there a need to manage actually third-party IP in general? So regardless of whether it is open source or commercial or freeware, there are different level of risks that you might want to manage. So, for example, if you're bringing in open source and using it, you might and combining it with your own commercial product, you need to think, do I have all the rights that I need if there is a bug, if there is a security bug, for example? Am I able to fix that issue? Can I rely on the community to fix that issue? So that support and maintenance aspect is really important. The other thing which I think was raised last time is compatibility. So you might bring in open source and then include it in your commercial product, and that could create sort of a different. Sorry, it's a bit windy. That might create a different set of issues, such as compatibility. So, for instance, if your own agreement puts restrictions that are not compatible, and a very good example of that, if I taking some source code and choose to license it under a proprietary license, and then I put a restriction saying you can only use it for this architecture, that might be conflicting with the open source license. So again, it is important to think about that compatibility. And I don't know, Andrew, whether in your session next week, whether you're planning to talk about compatibility issues or things.
Yeah,
so that would be quite. Yes. Yeah, that would be quite useful to talk about. Mm-hmm.
May I interrupt just to say that I've missed a chunk because the line went click and I was cut off. I'm just back in now.
Right. So I was just talking about why is it from particularly if you work for an organization or for represent a client, why it's important for them to think about how they manage any third-party IP, not necessarily just open source. And I talked about we've all seen a number of security issues arising in code, both proprietary and open source, where as somebody who might be distributing that code, you care about your customers' exposure, and you need to ensure that you have the ability to apply any fixes to that code if you need to. Or to ensure that if there are major bugs, you're able to make the necessary changes. So that's a key consideration there. Then I just talked about incompatibilities in licenses, and again, I'm not going into too much detail there because Andrew will cover. We'll cover that in his discussion. But again, that's something that we continuously part of our process. We look at every time there is a piece of open source that is combined with an ARM proprietary product. We look at it and say, how does this interact with our commercial agreement? Is there any issue there? So a good practice is really for the organization to have a clear process by which they bring in any third-party IP and consider where in their organization that code is used and what is the applicable license and how they're using it, because that enables clarity on what are the licensing obligations that the organization need to comply with. And I think at one point probably we can do some session on open chain, and I can go more on into how we have implemented policies and processes in place to ensure sort of compliance with open source. And in fact, there is a case study that I can circulate round. Gave a talk a while back talking about, as an organization, what we did in terms of changes. In addition to that, one of the key things from a business perspective that we find sort of when we use open source, we see a lot of customers, particularly those who are new to open source, sort of having a paranoia around any open source that might be in the product that you're delivering to them. And very often they see sort of you might be including some open source and declaring that you're using open source and including all the applicable licenses and the copyright notices, and they say no, you can't deliver anything to me that is subject to open source because that could have an impact on the risk on my product, etc. So again, from a business perspective, that's a key driver to having clarity as to how you manage open source in your product. And one very good example is that if you're able to demonstrate that you have a clear process and you're conformant with compliance initiatives such as open chain, you can very quickly address any customer queries and avoiding any delays in closing your commercial deal. So that's, again, it depends on whether you represent a commercial organization or not. The other thing that over the years we have seen, if you have a clear process to manage open source, you avoid repeat requests. So in the early years, if I look back, in the last 7-8 years, each group within ARM used to manage its use of open source and other third-party IP sort of in a very fragmented way, in a very sort of siloed way. which means that if one part of ARM was using a piece of open source, a different part of the organization didn't have that visibility and will have to sort of ask for permission to use that open source or that third-party IP, and that might get reviewed by a different lawyer to the one that managed the first request, so leading to significant number of delays. And it was quite interesting. We did a review before we implemented a sort of a clear process and tooling in place. We did an analysis of over 600 requests to use third-party IP, and it was incredible because we have spent as a minimum 4 hours per request, and I think it was about 30% of those requests were repeat requests to use the same piece of third-party IP. So having that clarity and a clear tool in place to be able to check, has something been approved previously? Has it been approved for use in my product as a user within an organization? It is incredibly valuable. And of course, if you have that degree of visibility, it means that you can quite quickly extend on any approval that you may have done for the first request to apply to the second request, so that avoids a lot of frustrations from a developer perspective. So, are there any questions? Do I still have anybody on the line?
Yes,
you do.
Yeah,
you do. None from me.
Stunned us
Thank
into
you.
silence. There's no question.
Okay, so that is really the end of the actual presentation that I had that I prepared previously. So I guess for me, it would be useful if people think of, are there any particular areas that they would like to deep dive into, sort of, and then we can arrange for either a future session, or are there any other questions that spring to mind that maybe we haven't covered here, that I could either answer now, or we could think about arranging further sort of training in the future.
I do have a general question, because when you've given the resume of your presentation, I've got this one on procurement coming up quite a bit later. And one thing that I'm interested in is, what kind of level ought it to be pitched at, and how long ideally should one be looking to actually speak for, and how long to allow questions?
Ian, I can answer that quickly for you. You should pitch it at absolute beginner's level,
okay,
both in terms of procurement experience and in terms of open source, because we are running these sessions, and I hope we'll have more people join over time, but we're running them with a group that will fluctuate. People can listen afterwards, which is great. But we are running this for people who are bright, who are young, and who are interested, but may or may not have experience. And I'm sure we're all happy to be reminded. Sami, can I ask you? Sorry, Ian.
Yeah.
Helpful. That's helpful.
Good. Sami, I wonder if you would like to introduce OpenChain a little bit more now, but whether we should do a session perhaps with you and a developer from ARM, maybe someone like Andy Waffa, talking about your experience of implementing good open source compliance through OpenChain, and maybe a very practical session if you would be interested towards the end, so probably getting to mid-April to the end of April on the Fridays.
Yeah, I mean that's fine. So I mean, probably as you know, Andy Waffa is the head of our open source office, but I'm a stakeholder in the open source office. So I could actually, rather than dragging Andrew to that, I could sort of obviously do a session on OpenChain specifically, and repeat what I have done I gave a keynote speech in Japan in December about a sort of open source compliance and the ARM sort of story, sort of in accomplishing compliance and some of the challenges that we have encountered. And I could also combine that with some of the practical aspects of you know, what we tend to do in terms of preparing the artifacts that accompany our products from an open source perspective, things like copyright notices and licenses. So that's fine. I could think of one or two people within engineering that would be able to take us through that practical aspect of the compliance side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that sounds really interesting from my perspective. It must have been very interesting and useful.
And Robert, personally, it's nothing to do with you, Sami. I think these sessions have been great, but I would like to bring a developer in to talk to us as well. So that, I think having the two of you would be really great if we could do that. Of course, it'd be great to hear your keynote, and maybe we should do that and then have Andy come in at the end if he would do it.
Yeah. Then no, absolutely. It's no issue. I'm just saying probably Andy does the high level rather than the day to day. So I think if the idea is that we demonstrate what we do from a developer perspective to achieve compliance, I would need to think of somebody else other than Andy.
Okay, sorry, I missed that bit. I didn't get that up. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's fine. I'm not saying no, we wouldn't do it, but I'm just saying he's probably not the right person because he's like me, is involved in defining the strategy, the policy, and the process. Rather than the implementing those from a practical perspective. So I'm happy to arrange for that. I think probably the April timeframe might not work for us. I would say I would aim early May. I think at the minute, as you know, we have all moved to remote working. So I would, and again, our engineering team in particular, are sort of still adjusting to making sure that they're able to work remotely. So I would say sort of early May probably would be more realistic.
Thank you.
Yeah. While we've got everyone on the line, so it'd be quite useful to hear from everyone whether they think it would be useful that one of the topics that I go into when I do my session, or alternatively as another session, is whether people want to hear about how I would go through an M&A due diligence exercise from the perspective of open source compliance, because I use OpenChain as a framework to facilitate that. So I mean that could either, I'd be happy to do that either as a separate session or to build that into the session that I'm doing next time on deep dive licensing.
Hello, it's Katie. Yes, please, that would be really useful. I've done DD or no before, and it's usually quite interesting how it's developing and how people perceive it, but I think that would definitely be really useful.
Okay. So, yeah, brilliant. So would we like to do that as a separate session, or shall I try and build that into my session next time?
I think because there's quite a few lawyers in this group, they probably want to pick your brain on licenses, boring as I personally find licensing, and I know that.
Yeah.
I always think it's the great, don't take this the wrong way, Andrew, I always think it's the sort of hoax of open source that it's all about licensing, because licensing is really important and you must have an appropriate license or it just ain't open.
Yeah.
But personally, I think all the other stuff is more interesting. Once you've got the licenses, once you've got a basic understanding, and you understand some of the complexities you're going to explain to people in an hour, there's so much more that's really interesting, like trademarks and patents and the stuff that you're talking about with M&A. So I think that in the compliance piece. So I think that would be great if you did 2 sessions. That may mean that we actually have a 6 to 8 module course for everybody, and if they're recorded, we can let people who've missed the first couple listen to those, and then we can encourage others to come along and listen to these sessions, because at least from my perspective, I'm really enjoying it. Don't know about everybody else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So I'll just stick specifically to licensing next time. And if anyone's got any particular topics that they would like me to concentrate on, if they could let me know, that would be helpful as well.
I think, Andrew, we have the compatibility. Sorry, go ahead, Ian.
Sorry, Ian, if I can flag up here, there is the ancient old chestnut, which is still kicking around, which got me into this in a very, very long time ago, as Andrew will remember, and that is compatibility with a embedded patents well, basically it was specifically in FRAND, or you're concerned with FRAND licensing of patents in in standards. But I mean, more generally, it's still an issue which keeps on rumbling on. What licenses can I use if I'm going to come head up against a patent here?
Yes, I mean, I can certainly sort of do a few minutes on that.
I don't think it's an entire seminar, but I'm just
whether you're just volunteering to do one, Ian. That's the question, because it's a really interesting.
No, I'm not sure that I am.
I was just thinking Amanda there.
I think an IP session on trademarks and patents, if you like. With my OIM.
that would be useful. That would be useful. I was thinking in terms of pitching this, perhaps Andrew to start with the license, and I would like to sort of go into a bit of detail on license compatibility or incompatibility, whichever way you choose to look at it, particularly around incompatibility between open source licenses, and more importantly, incompatibility with proprietary, either freeware or open source or commercial licenses. What examples of those would be quite useful. So, and again, perhaps Andrew, if you're going to, or if you're volunteering to do a session around M&A, is perhaps to wait until we've done the open chain introduction.
No, I think that would be great, because I use open chain as sort of framework for that anyway. So
yes, exactly.
Already have an understanding of the way that open chain works, that it's going to make more sense.
Yeah.
So no, I concur completely.
Yeah. So is there any other area that we think would be useful? So if not, I am happy. Sorry.
I think we should do something led by developers. And I don't know whether we do a Q&A around open source, or we just get the developers' view and talk to them a bit about it. But I think it would be really nice, maybe someone like Chris Tam, who is one of our judges, who used to run the Debian project, or Cheryl Hung, who is another one of our judges for the awards, who is at the Cloud Native Foundation. Maybe getting them to talk about that kind of stuff would be good. There's things like paying the maintainers, the to-do group. There's stuff like reproducible builds, the kind of models that Tidy uses, commercial models.
Yeah, I think that's really, and also a little bit of history might be useful as well, because things like, for example, the history of Debian is really interesting, because then then you can see how the Debian free software guidelines morph into the open source definition and so on, and you get an idea for the different camps, people who concentrate more on software freedom than they do on software availability, and that sort of thing. I think a bit of a sort of discursive dive into the history of some of these things would actually help to put things into context a bit.
We're geeking out here, or nerding out, whatever the appropriate term these days is. Does that sound interesting to the actual future leaders on the call?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Because there's so much interesting. So Simon Phillips is in the south of England. He's just about to retire as the director of the OSI. We can ask Simon, who is an elder statesman of open source without a doubt, if he would do a sort of history session that would be quite interesting. We can ask Chris Lamb from Debian to do something around the Debian project, and I can talk to him about some of the developer stuff. And we can ask Cheryl to talk about the cloud native and the platform stuff, which is really, you know, where we've got to as time moves on, as history moves on. So we can set those up April, May. So I think we now have a course that will run through to the end of May. And I think, Robert, we need to make sure we record these properly, which I'm sure you're doing anyway. I haven't listened to a recording yet. And that we put them up on the Nextcloud for anybody who joins this group. But sure, that we also ask all of you to go out to your peer group within the Future Leaders, or any colleagues who don't necessarily want to join the group but would find these sessions beneficial, and invite them along.
Yeah.
So Amanda, I have given we have a few more minutes left, I'm happy to sort of just give a high level of how we have chosen to manage the open source around the consume side. Sort of over the next few minutes, just to put things into perspective from a practical sort of analysis, if you like, as somebody who does the governance for third-party IP. Would people be interested in that?
I think that's useful. Yes, definitely.
Okay, so if you recall, I did talk about open source compliance, and I said it depends on the license, but more importantly, the license obligations typically would kick in depending on how you're using that open source and what you're doing with it. So in ARM, we have chosen to divide use of all third-party IP, open source or non-open source, into two key categories. One is distribution, and the other one is internal use. So in the internal use is where you're bringing perhaps a piece of third-party IP and an open source piece of code that you're just going to use to develop an ARM product, but nothing gets distributed from the source code or the original third-party IP that you're bringing into the company. And sort of in the majority of cases, regardless of what the license is, the risk, we classified that risk as relatively low risk because there is no distribution. Because again, the majority, particularly if you think of open source licenses, the majority of obligations kick in when you distribute outside of your organization. So that's why, for example, in what we refer to as the TPIP tracker, this is our approval workflow. We created a tool that tracks where we're doing any form of distribution of third-party IP within ARM. And we look at it from three different areas. And again, what I said earlier on, we look at it from what license applies to that piece of third-party IP. What is the third-party IP? Where am I downloading it from? And more importantly, how am I using it? And what is the intent? Am I intending to distribute this as part of an ARM product? So these are the three key areas that we look at when somebody puts a request in. And we can do some interesting things such as, I don't know, let's see, I do a search with maybe DS5, I don't know why, DS5. Oh, sorry, I need to reset data, sorry. All. Sorry, it's a bit slow. Yeah, you can see that I just did a search with DS5 on the ARM product. So that has brought every single ARM product that has the word DS and the version of the ARM product, and also how many pieces of third-party IP are associated with that product. So I'm going to pick this one, which has 27 pieces of third-party IP. So if I click on that one, it will give me sort of the name of the product, the version of the product, who the product manager is, various sort of housekeeping things. And then it will tell me that there are 27 pieces of third-party IP associated with that product again. So I click on there. So it gives me the bill of material of third-party IP. And then if I look here, you can see that there is this is the name of the third-party IP, Apache Log4j, and what version of that particular piece of open source, what is the applicable license, and also how am I using it. So this here says distribution in binary form without modification. So that then clearly enables me to understand what obligations I may need to comply with. And you can drill down to each request. And if I click on that, sorry, it's a bit slow. Come on. This is where here we go. So it's showing me that specific request. This is when the creator requested the use of that piece of third-party IP. It goes through an initial sort of triage and assessment by a compliance specialist to just look at and make sure that all the information that is required when we come to doing the business legal approval, that the information is there, and then it goes into our the specific legal partner for that particular part of the business, who then look at, okay, so this is the third-party IP, and this is the applicable license. It's Apache v2, so that's all. Sort of, you know what that license is. That's details about the third-party IP. And if I scroll down, these are the applicable use cases. So here that we are distributing in source form without modification, we're dynamically linking to our software. We're also distributing in binary form, and we expect our customers to do further distribution. And that is really very important, so they can select as many as they want in terms of applicable use cases, because for the lawyer, when they receive this information, based on that and what the license is, they will be able to define what are the obligations. So for example, here, in terms of the obligation, we say the engineering team will follow the guidance based on the OSS playbook that we have internally, or we have created internally, where you say you need to keep the copyright notices, etc. So we give them sort of guidance as to what they need to do once this request has been approved. So that is really sort of in a nutshell what we tend to do, and this is visible to everybody in the whole organization. So any developer can go and search and look for their particular product. The other bit, if you remember, I talked about reuse and improving efficiency. So if I go back in again, I can do a different search of what has been approved previously within ARM. So I'll show you. Sorry, it's really slow. So if I go into, instead of searching by an ARM product, I can go and look at a slightly different part of the catalog. And some of you might be familiar with Boost. So I'll go and let me. It's really. So if I just search by Boost, this is an open source library. So you can see that ARM uses a number of versions of the Boost library, and in there you can see that, for example, here there are 11 requests associated with them. So let's say our engineer is interested in this latest version. Actually there is one here, version 1.69, but this has more requests associated with it. So you can go and click on that and do the search the other way around. Say, where is this third-party IP used? And it will display all the ARM product where this library has been incorporated into. So again, it has 27 different requests. It's a bit too many clicks, but you can see that the Boost library version 1.64 is used in 27 different ARM products, and it could be that it's actually different versions of the ARM product. So it could be version 1 or version 2 of the same product. We do with that granularity. We do it with so for example, with the development studio, we do for every single version of that product. If it's still used in the product, we track that degree of granularity, and you display key information. So for example, if a developer does not find the product that they want to use Boost in, it listed here, they can then go and say, okay, I want to request use of it in the product that I'm developing, and they trigger a new request. And again, this is quite critical when it comes to, I talked about security vulnerabilities. If there is a security vulnerability with a particular open source library, you can go and quickly review which ARM product are impacted by this library, and immediately take action to rectify that problem. So quite powerful. And as I said, this catalog is visible to all ARM employees. So it could be somebody from legal, or it could be somebody, a developer who is interested in using a particular piece of open source and they want to reuse it. They can use the catalog to do that. Any questions?
No question for me, but it sounds like a really impressive tool and looks like something that's very, very powerful to actually give you an idea of what's being used where, and also then to keep drilling down further and further into sort of each subset of kind of what code is used where and where else is it used and things like that. So yeah, very impressive.
Yeah. Michael, I find this really interesting on the basis that Michael, we talked before about OpenChain. I mentioned it to you when we were chatting about open source and the kind of systems that people have in place. So I would hope that's quite useful for you too, to see how an organization that does a lot of coding manages the code base.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still a long way to go sort of in terms of improving. I mean, I took over management of third-party IP now around 5 years ago, and that was one of the key projects that I and my team worked on developing, because again, we're asking our developers to do quite a lot of things, and in doing that, you need to ensure that actually what you're asking to do is scalable. We have over 5,000 developers, so if you don't have that sort of degree of efficiency, nobody will follow any process or policy that you put in place.
Well, and it's also good, I imagine, to help get out of the way of letting the developers do their to develop as well. That's the why they're there. You want to make this easy to make it so they can actually do what they need to do. So. Yeah.
That's right. And you want them to focus on differentiating. If there is something that is out there that is somebody has done it already, why do they need to reinvent the wheel? They might as well use that and focus on the differentiation rather than on redeveloping. Of course, one of the things that we do, if you remember, I showed the wheel. what we tend to do is, for example, in Boost, we tend to also contribute to the library. So we do both the consume and the contribute back, because if we develop any features that we think actually we need to incorporate into that library, we then go and contribute as well as consume. The other thing that this is useful as an organization, if there is any form of litigation from the legal side, if there is a ongoing litigation for a piece of third-party IP, you can quite quickly review which products are affected, and for example, if there is a reason to remove that library, you can then quickly put a plan for those products so that they would discontinue using that particular piece of third-party IP. And this is why when we do the tracking, we track by version of ARM product. So we know that every single version of the ARM product, what is the bill of material of third-party IP that is included in that. and we have flexibility for our engineers to add additional third-party IP or remove existing third-party IP because it's no longer required, or maybe they have found a different alternative, so they can do that in the next generation of the ARM product.
So it's helping them also sort of remove unnecessary code to kind of keep that code base clean and reduce the sort of risk of compatibility problems further down the line by getting rid of it if it's not needed anymore. Yeah, that's a great way of doing it.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Excuse me, folks. I wonder if you, I've got another conference coming up in about 5 minutes, so I need to prepare for that. So do you mind if I love you and leave you?
Thank you, Ian.
Not at all. Thank
Pleasure.
you.
See you. Bye.
Thank you, Ian.
Bye.
Bye.
Robert, Sami, before you wrap up, I wanted to take the opportunity to mention that you will all get the OpenUK update on Monday. We'll send our monthly update out. We will start Tea Break Tuesdays probably on Tuesday the 4th of April, and that will be an 11 o'clock on a Tuesday Zoom call. I think it will be Zoom. When we will have a 5-minute lightning talk on an open source issue, a discussion, and a sort of stand-up meeting where people can just check in and talk about things that they're interested in around open, or even just see how everybody's doing. So Tea Break Tuesday is likely to start Tuesday the 4th of April at 11. The OpenUK Kids competition we will be updating in the next week or two, probably with some major changes and news, but we've got a lot of big discussions going on around that. And the OpenUK Awards launch at 9 a.m. on Monday. They're going to have 10 weeks of nominations. It's going to run through to the 15th of June. We've moved the whole of OpenUK week to the week of 19th of October. Hopefully we'll be back and face-to-face in London and Manchester and other places. We will do it virtually. We won't move it twice. It would be great if you, when you get your email, feel free to share it. I'm going to flag the Future Leaders Group, and hopefully by Monday have a full program that we can share with people. And I will extend that out, if all the speakers are okay, as far as the Society of Computers and Law, who we were planning to do joint events with, to see if any of their folk would like to do these. And perhaps also see if we can get CPD allocated to an 8 to 10 week course. Everybody thinks that's a good idea.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay. So Katie and Robert, I will CC you on the email to the different potential speakers and keep you in the loop as we move that forward. And I'll sort of leave it to you two to manage how you want to bring anybody who joins us who's not part of the Future Leaders Group in, and the discussions you want to have with them about whether they join the group or not. Are there any questions for Sami on the presentation, for me on administration? Please spread the word about the awards. It'd be great to have some nominations from you all. Then I'll hand over to Robert.
No questions.
Wrap up.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, sounds like no questions. I just want to say thank you very much to Sami for running this presentation and for giving up his time to both prepare for this and give us time to actually give the presentation. I'll send around the link of the recording afterwards, and hopefully speak to everyone either on the coffee on Tuesday, or I think our next session on next Friday, which I think is in the same time slot, which Andrew will be taking us through licensing generally. Brilliant. Unless there's anything else from anyone else on the call.
Thank you, everyone, for listening patiently.
Yeah, thank you, Sami. No, that was
Thanks,
really, really interesting. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Cheers.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.